now it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage and online Heather Adkins, Robert Silvers, and Jeff Moss.
Yay! Woo!
Have a good discussion.
Hey, thank you. So let's make sure Heather pops up. She's supposed to be here somewhere remotely.
Hi, can you hear me?
There you are.
Hello.
Yes. Yep. We can hear and see you. Perfect. Okay, so hey, this is going to be our panel. We're going to have a conversation. For those of you who tuned in, I believe it was February, we did a sort of a preview of what the Cyber Safety Review Board was up to, what they were working on. We did this kind of Q&A at Black Hat with Rob and Heather. But now they have completed the first review. The verdict is in. And we're going to be talking about their findings, some of the lessons learned, and where they go from there. So first, let's do a quick brief intro. Rob Silvers?
Rob Silvers. I'm the Undersecretary for Policy at the Homeland Security Department. I also serve as chair of the Cyber Safety Review Board.
So this is your fault?
It is. It's our fault that we're here. It's my fault that we're here.
Okay, perfect. And Heather Adkins.
Hi, I'm Heather Adkins. I'm a vice president of security engineering at Google, and I'm very delighted to co-chair the CSRB here with Rob. It's a real honor and a pleasure.
All right, so let's get started. First, though, if I remember correctly, the enabling legislation that created the CSRB mentioned SolarWinds, but you did Log4j first. Are you going to have to go back and do SolarWinds? Maybe talk through how you got to Log4j in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for the audience's benefit, in brief, the Cyber Safety Review Board was created from President Biden's executive order last year on cybersecurity, and it is really an unprecedented public-private organization to make an authoritative fact-finding and then lessons learned and recommendations coming out of the very biggest cybersecurity.
And it's all public, right?
And every report will be public, and half the members are from the federal government. National Cyber Director Chris Inglis, the leads for cyber from the FBI, NSA, and otherwise. And then half the members are from the private sector, with Heather, the lead private sector member, and then luminaries from the cybersecurity world. We took on as our first review, when the board launched in February of this year, the Log4j vulnerability. And the feeling was really that this was a fresh event that had a lot to unpack in terms of, for virtually every kind of organization out there. Every organization was impacted because Log4j is sprinkled across the ecosystem. Yeah. It still is. And it also had serious ramifications for the open source community and how open source software is secured, how the community can effectively respond in an incident where basically you have to patch everything immediately because of the severity. And our feeling was that this
repatch and then repatch again,
and sometimes multiple patching cycles. And so the thought was that this would really be an amazing opportunity for the board to jump in on its inaugural effort towards a really high impact event that literally affected everyone.
Right, right. Heather? Does he speak the truth?
I don't know that Rob knows how to not speak the truth, which is always a good thing to have I think look, Rob said it great. I think Log4j was probably one of the most impactful events probably that I can ever remember in terms of cybersecurity. And I think we're going to probably dive into that a little bit. But I think another thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about software ecosystems, a lot of these events start to look the same. So while we didn't look at SolarWinds as an incident specifically, we did end up touching on a lot of the things that would have come up in a review on SolarWinds about how secure software is built, the kinds of tools and the kinds of capabilities we need in the ecosystem. And throughout the report, we do make footnote references to areas of recommendations and findings that actually do relate to SolarWinds. So I think we still got the benefit of looking at software through the lens of SolarWinds, having been through that experience. But like Rob said, I think Log4j was a big moment for all of us, and it was really the right thing to do at the time.
Okay, so why don't you step us through, we'll set the stage. So you create the team, you get the members, you pick Log4j, and then what? I mean, it's a sea of things you could explore, right? You could go to Shodan and try to count the numbers and see how quickly things are being patched. You could interview people to see what strategies are working. Like, how do you start to wrap your hands around a problem of such magnitude?
Yeah, absolutely. So we split the board up into different subcommittees to look at different parts of the event and the response. And I think what really surprised a lot of people is how deep the fact-finding could go. I mean, this was not a bunch of experts coming together and batting around, policy ideas. I mean, this was like an operational fact-finding engagement. And we ultimately, the board spoke with over 80 organizations and security researchers to get data, and got data as well. What did you see? How did you respond? What did you see in terms of exploitation? How did this impact your organization? What do you think are the lessons learned? And what that means is we actually created a factual roll-up of how the Log4j vulnerability disclosure process, the response, all went down and answered a lot of unanswered questions just about the factual record. And I think that's one of the really innovative parts of this board that fills a gap in the ecosystem that wasn't there.
So the reporting, you think the private sector reporting just, they didn't have this focus or this depth or dwell time, or like, why wasn't it coming out through normal kind of InfoSec reporting?
I think it was a missing part of the ecosystem. There's nobody, until the CSRB was created, there's really nobody whose job it is to convene 80 different kinds of companies and security researchers, and without any particular agenda, hear what they have to say, and then say, here's authoritatively what happened. Companies might investigate what happened to themselves,
right? No.
But that's narrow, and it's also not for the public. It's not for the good of the community.
Right.
Our charge was, let's figure out what happened, just so the community can know, and then let's draw out lessons learned and recommendations that are really actionable from that. Again, for the good of the community, not with any particular, organization's agenda.
Is it all sort of like off the record, so they'll tell you the real deal and you abstract it? So you have this sort of Chatham House ability to get at the real facts? Or are companies like, well, our lawyers will let you know, or we can't admit that we screwed up, or...
We have confidentiality protections available so that companies can tell us things and we could use it, but in an anonymized way to animate the thinking and the findings. Some companies were thrilled to share their data and have us come out and share that with the world. Heather might have more to share on that too.
Yeah.
I was really pleasantly surprised how many organizations came and spoke with us, some in person, some spent many hours with us on video calls, wrote extensive documentation for us to look through. And it was from a variety of partners in the ecosystem. We spoke directly with folks from the Apache Software Foundation who manage Log4j, all the way to cybersecurity vendors who had watched the ecosystem respond in real time. We spoke to organizations who had witnessed exploitation, and we even heard from the People's Republic of China, the government. And I think it's a testament to the appetite that people have to get the facts out there. I think one of our biggest findings was that information spread quickly on Twitter, which was great. You had a lot of real-time information, but it was difficult to get canonical information about what was really happening. So I think there's an appetite to pull this kind of information together in a way where everybody can trust the facts, or at least trust that they have been deeply looked at in some way.
So there's a lot of immediate anecdotal evidence on Twitter, but like you were saying, the canonical, that takes time and effort. Did you notice any difference between the participation or the way you interacted with, say, a commercial entity versus, say, an open source project? Or did everybody kind of participate in the same way, or could you see sort of distinct lines across different, say, sectors or countries? Or
I'd be interested in Heather's observations, but I will say that the board approached every stakeholder, big or small, powerful or not, the same way and gave the same opportunity. So, you know, we talked with friendly governments. We talked with the UK, we talked with Israel, with their national cyber authorities to see what they saw so we could get the benefit, in addition to obviously talking with CISA. We also sent an information request, as we did to so many other stakeholders, to the government, as Heather said, of the People's Republic of China, because they had a substantial role in some of the background behind this event. And we actually spoke with a representative of the Chinese government in a full board meeting, in the same way that the board spoke with U.S. entities and organizations. So we were really equal opportunity.
Yeah.
And you know, in terms of how different kinds of organizations responded back to us, like, I'm not sure I can identify an exact pattern.
Yeah.
I can just say that overall, it was really good to see 80 different stakeholders being willing to come to the table with us and you know, speak with us, give data. That was remarkable.
Yeah, I would say the thing that stood out for me as a pattern was that we were able to speak with a number of the foundations who support open source. And they have a particular role in this ecosystem that is very unique. They're volunteer-based. A lot of the projects are governed according to how they want to run the project. So there's a lot of variety there. And they also have a lot of very strong opinions about what should and shouldn't be happening within their communities. And I think that diversity was certainly very different than some of the commercial entities we spoke to, where companies are run in very specific ways. And I think we learned a lot about the benefits of the open source community having the freedom to run software the way they run software. But we also learned that there are millions, if not billions, of people relying on them getting it right. And so that was actually a pretty interesting tension that came out. I'm not sure it's necessarily a pattern, but the different foundations across the globe that build open source software, manage open source software, have really particular ways of doing that. And it's a very diverse set of ways.
Because I'm curious, everybody can take open source code and they can immediately patch it with their own homebrew fix, or they can wait for the actual developer to fix it. So it's sort of everybody's waiting on the authoritative log4j fix, but others can't wait. They're going to patch it themselves. So you probably have a whole, almost like a train wreck of different kinds of patching and different kinds of solutions all trying to fix it at the same time. Did you find that, well, I guess we'll get that into the conclusions, like does it make sense to have to wait for the one patch, or is it a free-for-all? What gets you the best results? Kind of in a remediation phase. But I'm curious on this, yeah, on the strengths of open source, strengths of closed source, especially from, say, a private sector Google angle, where a lot of the work does come from the strength of the open community. Maybe you can talk us through a little bit of that disclosure or the discovery process as you are sort of unpacking Log4j, where there are sort of unforeseen discoveries, where there, you know, the vulnerability keeps surprising the researchers, you know, the multiple patches. Maybe you can talk a little bit through, you know, the early stages of maybe when you'd only interviewed 5 or 10 and you thought it was one thing, and now you're at 80 and it's a completely different, you know, can of worms.
Yeah, so a couple of things on the disclosure process and the response. So on the disclosure process, Alibaba, an Alibaba security researcher discovered the vulnerability, and the board looked into this very carefully. And we concluded that that Alibaba did the right thing. They followed coordinated disclosure processes. They took the vulnerability to the Apache Software Foundation, and provided all the information they had so that Apache could begin its work of looking into it and developing a patch. In terms of the patching cycles, yes, there were a few iterations of the patch, and we definitely found that this induced some patching fatigue and confusion in the CISO and Network Defender
Like everybody
community.
surged to do this, and then by the second or third surge, they're done. Like,
Yeah.
there's no more surging.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it really, and it was the holidays time, you know, it was leading up to Christmas. I mean, this was, the board found really, may have been very well been the largest mass-scale cyber response in history. Just given the intent, the severity of the vuln, the fact that it was literally everywhere, and the fact that companies, even really sophisticated, well-defended companies, didn't know where they had Log4j in their environments because it had been rolled up into so many different software packages, which is one of the unique, you know, aspects of open source software. And so network defender fatigue and patching fatigue was definitely a real aspect of this response. Heather.
I wanted to come back to the disclosure. The disclosure to from Alibaba to the Apache Software Foundation, you know, happened through the usual means of coordinated disclosure. And ASF, to their credit, began working immediately on the fix. And one of the things we learned about the open source community is that many times these fixes are done in the open. And that means in GitHub, in issue tracking systems, you can actually see the fix being developed. And that was the case here with Apache as well. Now, they didn't mark it as a security vulnerability with a big sign on it that said, hey, this is a vulnerability. But anybody keeping an eye on their Git pulls or looking at their release candidates would have seen that they were working on fixing some code in the JNDI functionality. And we think that is actually what happened before Apache could release an official fix for everybody and begin the mass patching phase. Somebody noticed, this is our hypothesis, but somebody noticed this being done. And we begin to see posts on WeChat in China talking about this release candidate that has the security fix. We start to see the Minecraft exploitation that everybody knows about happen shortly after. But this is a very common practice within the open source community, and we see it actually across many very large projects. And it was a kind of a moment for us to sit back and think, well, you know, as we think about the software ecosystem and getting patches out quickly and that surge that had to happen, you know, I don't want to sort of sneak preview the recommendations too quickly, but, you know, this is an opportunity for us to think about how do we build a software ecosystem where we can all move very quickly, because we know that things happen in the open, that bugs get dual discovered, that they get exploited before they're disclosed. And so that was a really important finding for us in terms of how we want to reshape the ecosystem on software.
So maybe have those sort of updates only visible to those contributing until a certain time, and then you would unmask it, so to speak, list it for public consumption, or?
I think that's one approach. You know, we spoke to a lot of people about this kind of issue, and I think that would be considered controversial, depending on your point of view. I think another approach might be for us to take a look at, you know, how do we make the knowledge of the bug somewhat irrelevant? Actually, it's our 19th recommendation in the report, but can we turn the patching problem upside down and make the software more self-aware and be able to respond much more quickly? Because there is a whole host of things other than just developing in the open. But I think it should inspire us to be, you know, really ambitious about, you know, rethinking how software ecosystems are done, because this surge that happened in December of 2021 is not something that we can do every day. I mean, there's hundreds of vulnerabilities found all the time. We can't always constantly be surging. And so, Jeff, I think some people might find the hide your bugs approach controversial. I actually think, you know, we're going to encourage the ecosystem to be much more foundational on, you know, how do we just do things differently altogether.
So I want to go back to something Rob said, which was a lot of people had it and they didn't even know it, right? They have all these issues. And another thing that happened this year was the S-bomb, right? Really, it's been talked about for a long time, but now it's starting to take on life of its own. So did that play a role in any of this? Could it have played a role in any of this had S-bomb been more widely accepted, say, years ago? how do you see the two intersecting? Because I believe one of the findings in the report is that SBOM wasn't used by any of the people. So it's a little too early to tell if that's a useful technique. Maybe you walk us through that.
Yeah, I think what the board, that's correct. The board did not find any stakeholders that were able to use SBOM to successfully get at.
It's a little early, right? I mean,
but
how many are actually?
But the board felt that SBOM has tremendous potential as a concept, that organizations need to accelerate their efforts using automation and tooling to get SBOM to a state where it can be practically used out in the wild,
right.
And also recommended that all software developers should be developing and shipping SBOMs together with their software products. So the board is a total believer in the SBOM concept, but it has to be evolved. And Heather led a lot of work, the board's work studying SBOMs and how they were used here. I would turn it over to her.
Absolutely. And we had a number of industry participants on the board who have studied this a lot. Katie Masuris is another. I think we all recognize the intent behind SBOMs in this space, but the standard features aren't there to really let us see version information, for example. So the ability to say, well, I have log4j, but is it a vulnerable version? And then secondly, these kind of deep dependency chains that we especially see in the open source space, where software is included, many chains down the layer during the compile, and it's tricky. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done with SBOMs. We did speak with at least one organization that had SBOMs in place for some part of its infrastructure, and they're very proud of that, and it's a great achievement. But that, because that feature set is not there in the standards, it is difficult. And then the automation to actually make use of it. If you had a database full of SBOMs, what would you do with it when log4j comes up, right? So we need automation and the tooling around it to actually make it useful. But I think we all recognize its potential. And I think, CISA's got a lot of great work happening on SBOMs. There's a lot of energy around this right now. And I think given that, if you were to ask me again in 5 years, I think we'd be in a really different place.
And just to add on, another thing that I think CISOs, for example, can really take away from this review and take it to their boards, their leadership, is it really reinforced the importance of asset management and asset inventory. You have to know what you have and where. And that has been a staple of InfoSec talks for a long time. But you look at how it can come back to bite you in the throes of such a severe incident like this, and how it can cause an extended period of continued exposure to the most severe vulnerability ever discovered. And it really actually makes it quite tangible, the importance of those bread and butter issues like having good asset management and asset inventory. The only other thing I'll just say on this piece is that one of the recommendations of the board was that the federal government ought to look at using its procurement power, because we buy a lot of software, a lot of software, to drive software transparency. So make software developers that want to sell to us work on SBOM, work on other ways to have software transparency, and use the power of our purse to benefit, obviously, the software that comes to us, but that will drive the market, right? Because they'll use that to the benefit of the entire community.
There's history of that, right? I think DoD was an early adopter of IPv6.
Yeah.
Right? And even DNSSEC, even if they don't really use it, they'll pick a standard and they'll say, this will be important in the future, please, community, build to that. So yeah. So you think then the report actually amplifies the importance of an SBOM. It's not a story of where SBOM let us down. It really shows here's a case study of the promise of SBOM.
Very much so.
Right on. Okay, good. Because I kind of, I like SBOM. I always feel like that's the opening act of something greater, and we have to first get through the SBOM before we get to the second act. I don't know exactly what the second act is, but we need success on SBOM, so we're taken seriously when we come up with the second story of how we're going to secure software at scale or identify problems. And so I'm always concerned that if we screw up SBOM, we'll be poisoning the well. But so I'm very glad that we had some positivity there. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other findings. Heather, any of your favorite findings, or anything that you found that was surprising or enduring?
Well, they're all my favorites. That's why they're in there. We picked them. But I would say that
Favorite maybe is the wrong term, but
yeah, I think following on your idea of, where do we go with software ecosystems? SBOMs, we need them. One of the things we wanted to amplify in the report is some existing work happening amongst the open source foundations, in particular the Linux Foundation, the Open Security Software Foundation, OpenSSF, had just come together at the White House and released a mobilization plan for open source. And within that plan is some ambitious goals around finding resourcing for this mostly volunteer community who need developer training. What would it look like if we could get hobby hackers who write code that go into, billions of systems, some great security training. How do we get code audits done? One of the big questions we had in this review is, could someone have caught this functionality before it made it into production? And our finding was only with expertise, in the right kind of expertise during a code audit, would you have been able to flag that this was a problem? And the communities just don't have those kind of resources available to them all the time when they write code. And so we know that these organizations have to have the resources for things like that, but also, how do you get all of your code fuzzed at scale? How do you find bugs at scale? And so these plans are already in place. You'll find them referenced pretty heavily throughout the report. But I think, we're somewhat skiing on top of, a pretty good avalanche of support around the community that is looking at how do we help uplift within open source communities. And I'll say the final thing I'm excited about in that space is an incentive structure that they're calling scorecards. And the idea here is that open source projects will get a scorecard, and that as they uplift their security, their scorecard gets better. You can see that fitting in some very interesting ways from an incentives perspective to help not only fund the community, but also make security better. And we're interested in studying that a bit more as an ecosystem to see, how will it fit with, maybe government procurement or SBOMs or, even companies looking at software when they're trying to figure out, is this the right solution for me? What does the scorecard say, right? So I think these incentive structures are really important, but I think, there's not any one that's going to work. It needs to be a basket of incentives that we look at and see how they fit together.
Yeah, a couple of the other findings that I thought were really important. One is that Log4j is not over. This was not like a historic look back, but we're in the clear. I mean, this is what the board.
Yeah. So my next question was endemic vulnerability. Yeah. So, how common are endemic vulnerabilities, and we're just living with it now, right?
Yeah, we're going to be. They've happened before, but this is one that is so easy to exploit, and so ubiquitous that it's just particularly critical. And the board found that it is likely that organizations are going to be dealing with continued Log4j exposure for years to come, maybe a decade or longer.
So because it's easy to exploit and it's everywhere, wouldn't that be like a fast-moving forest fire? Like just everything's going to burn that is going to burn? Or are you just saying that people will find it's easy to exploit, but they'll just keep doing it for a decade?
Yeah, I think it's
a tough one, right? Because it's, on one hand, if it's so bad and it's so easy and so trivial, you would think it would just kind of burn itself out. Everything that could be compromised will be compromised because you don't have to try too hard to get to the code path. But
well, I don't think it's always easy for adversaries to find. Okay. So it's not a simple thing to scan for, and so either for the environment's host or for an adversary. Right? Heather, did you want to get in? Is that what you're going to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I think our model for this is probably Heartbleed. So back in 2014, very serious OpenSSL vulnerability, spread like a forest fire. Again, you had community surge. There was a report released very recently that showed there are still many hundreds of thousands of vulnerable OpenSSL instances on the internet. And I think the analogy here you want to look for is not the forest fire, but the hot spots that are underneath the forest floor that can flare up at any time. What I will say about the exploitation trend that we found is that the very early hours of exploitation on Log4j was mostly reconnaissance activity, people hearing about the bug, trying it out for the first time. And then we see the seriousness of it grow over time. You get cryptocurrency mining, it gets put into ransomware kits, into botnets. And then we start hearing from the threat intelligence vendors that, the nation state actors are getting involved. So I think you'll see the seriousness of some of these increase over time. I do think that surge, that rally that happened in December of 2021, really actually did put out a large majority of the early fires very quickly in such a way that the easy stuff to exploit got cleaned up. But I think you will continue to see, malicious threat actors innovate the way that they find and exploit this as they learn more about having the capability to do so. But it'll be around for a long, long time.
The other thing that was interesting was this was an amazing case study for how information spreads.
I was going to say, who are the early adopters of the exploiters, right? Like, who was first to pole position to take advantage of this?
Well, we found that once the vulnerability became publicly disclosed, you kind of had everybody, all the bad guys, kind of piling in. You had everything from the crypto miners and the ransomware artists and the commodity.
So there wasn't
actors,
one group,
nation states.
There wasn't one that was clearly paying the closest attention, first to market, to try to lock everybody else out?
Well, very importantly, when Log4j first broke out publicly, there was a lot of speculation out there whether the Chinese government in particular, because of some of the origin story of the disclosure came out of China, may have been exploiting this before it was known to the broader world. And actually what the board found, and we worked closely with Cloudflare on this to look at their data and others, we did not find evidence of exploitation before the existence of the vulnerability broke out into the public. And so this is an example of fact-finding, be like a really key piece of what this board does.
Put down the rumor.
We put that to bed.
Yeah.
I will say on the question of China, there's an interesting element to this story. So we talked about how Alibaba disclosed the vulnerability to Apache. There were public sort of news reports that came out around the time about how the Chinese government sanctioned Alibaba, like punished Alibaba for its role. And we were really interested in that as a board because from our view, after really looking into it, we think that this was a good vulnerability disclosure process. Right. And it was troubling to us that there would be some kind of punishment. Yeah. And ultimately, the board expressed that it was very troubling the regulatory regime that the Chinese government has in place surrounding vulnerability disclosure, and particularly rules that appear to require early reporting of any discovered zero-day vulnerabilities to the Chinese government. And the board expressed concern that this could give the Chinese government early access to very serious vulnerabilities before patches could be issued and network defenders could protect themselves. And so that was a very interesting aspect, a very interesting finding of the board as well.
Were those verified that they actually were sanctioned, or you could never get to that?
Well, what the board found through its fact finding was that the Chinese government was first informed of the vulnerability by Alibaba on December 13th of last year, but the public disclosure was December 9th, December 10th range, and so we don't believe in this case that early access was given to the Chinese government.
Right.
And
you just worry in the future.
But the Chinese government then punished Alibaba.
So that part was verified. They did get punished. It wasn't just some online rumor.
the Chinese government did not respond to our requests to confirm.
Can
They
neither
responded to other of our requests.
Right.
And would not confirm or deny or otherwise address whether they had given that punishment out. And there's no public accounting or official explanation. And so we found that troubling.
Right. So, so the next time this happens, right, you would have to continue to always do these postmortems to try to see if anything's been taken advantage of, to see then if the early access had been granted, right? And then how would that inform our policies? And so everybody keep logs. Right? It'll be very very useful in the future. So you mentioned something briefly about how information flowed online. Just want to briefly talk about that, and then I want to kind of close it up with like hearing about what you want the takeaways to be from the public, from this audience. Like what lessons are enduring across findings that will serve everybody in this audience, whether it's Log4j or the next thing, or are the findings always going to be hyper-specific, do you think, maybe to the specific incident?
Yeah, I'll start with the information flow, and then maybe Heather can talk about some of the recommendations. So what was very interesting, this is really a case study in a sort of a DEFCON 1 scenario of how network defenders get and circulate information. And what we found was, first of all, cyber Twitter. Twitter is the center of the universe.
Right. Okay,
when it comes to information flow on like an emerging InfoSec threat stream.
Not Facebook?
Twitter was
LinkedIn?
where Twitter, MySpace. Twitter was really where it was at.
Okay.
And what we found, and people found that really valuable because it's real time. But what we found was that it was also like information overload.
Well, and it's so ephemeral too, right? The answer might have been 6 hours ago and you missed it.
Yeah.
So now
it's ephemeral. And so what we found is that CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, played a really valuable role in sort of being the sort of collector and authoritative voice on, okay, here's the best of the best remediation and mitigation
They're kind of like
guidance
trying to
for you.
curate
It's like a curation function.
Yeah.
And it was really valuable. And then it also CISA did something that I don't believe the board could not find another example of the U.S. government or any other government doing anything similar, because it was so hard to know what software products had Log4j in it for a CISO. What CISA did was it worked with security researchers to build a GitHub repo with an inventory of all the software products that were known to have Log4j.
Wow.
So if you're a CISO and you can't figure it out, you can just go to CISA and this GitHub repo, and you can say, okay, I know I have these software packages. Okay, A, B, and C I need to address.
Right.
That was totally innovative. It was spun up on the fly very nimbly and with the security research community. And so I think what this incident showed was that CISA has this role of being kind of like the lighthouse.
Right, like
where there's a lot of great input, but it's all over the place. You don't know as a network defender what's the best advice or what's the most current, and CISA could kind of pull it all out together.
Right on.
Yeah.
So a big victory there.
Big victory there.
Yeah. Heather?
Yeah, I think the GitHub innovation was really great, and I sort of give a call out to Kevin Beaumont who worked on that. I think recommendations-wise, just to get to the second part of your question there, Jeff, our recommendations in the report are broken up into 4 areas. We've actually run through a lot of them here, but I think early reads of the report, people have focused a lot on what I've heard a colleague of ours call mom and apple pie kind of recommendations. Please do your security hygiene. Please make sure you have IT assets. But we also do have a section on this kind of the future of software. And I think that any review we do that involves software is going to have some of these components of the software ecosystem must support safety by default. And so expect to see that theme come up again and again. But I do want to call out kind of the 4th and final section, which is really more futuristic. So it's sort of mom and apple pie, but it's like apples from Mars, right? A little bit space age, a little bit futuristic. Really looking at how we create these good incentives for people to adopt the next generation of safety practices. But also taking a little bit of a look at what research do we need to do to build better software that's more self-defending, that is more self-aware, and upturning this sort of very manual patch, learn about it on Twitter and then patch your whole universe kind of process. We can't do that every day of the year at scale, and there is enough software now on this planet, let alone coming on the moon and on Mars, that we're going to have much more automated, much more safety by default software. And I think that really is the kind of pushing the boundaries, and why I'm so excited about the board, because we really have an opportunity to help levitate some of that to a highly visible view where we can get people working on it.
Okay, final thought, where to next? What's next for the CSRB? And do you figure this will be, 3 of these things a year, 1 a year? You wait for the apocalypse? You fill in your time in between apocalypses? What's the vision?
Yeah, the vision is we are using what we call the off-season, a term made up by our board's executive director, Abby Deft, to build up permanent staffing and infrastructure for this board, and we are refining procedures and streamlining. There was, an element to the first review of it was the initial test flight of the board. We had to address certain things and procedural things as they came up and make calls. And now we're into sort of a maturation phase. But I will tell you this, I believe that the first review proved this concept up. Right. I mean, there is nobody out there that thinks this is the wrong idea. This is, it's pretty clear to me, going to be an enduring institution in the cybersecurity ecosystem.
Right.
This is just something that wasn't getting done. The way that we have brought together the leading expertise from the public sector and the private sector is just an incredible, I mean, with the 14 incredible sets of experience and brainpower that we have from our members, you are looking at a problem from every perspective and with over a century of cybersecurity experience. So this is now about tuning this up for future reviews, which will surely come.
Fantastic. Right on. Well, if you haven't read the report, it's available online, right? Where do they
It's
read
available online. It's a public report.
Right on, as they should all be in one form or another.
We're committed to that. This needs to be transparent for the benefit of the community.
Right on. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for coming. And hopefully you've learned something, and we'll see you next time.